Hi, everybody. I'm sorry we're running a little late here. I'm glad that this is on video so the time is not as significant an issue. Oh man, we had an interesting meeting last night on Zoom with Beth Martini, who is the pastor, who is the assistant to the bishop, who handles the mobility issues for pastors in the synod. And Lancaster County is her turf, and she is helping us with St. John's call process. And so we have gotten that going, and the call committee should be cleared and ready to go forward. At this point in time, they have a full 6 people. And they're off and running. I am sorry to tell you that a member of the congregation, Gloria Murr, passed away this morning. We just found that out, and it was a COVID death. So, folks, please take it seriously. But anyway, I had my dog. I tell you what. Boxers are scary. He woke up at 3 o'clock this morning and was ready to go, and I didn't get much sleep. So here we are, the Book of God, and we're section 3. This is part 3, and we are looking at the part that Walter Wangren referred to as the Wars of the Lord, and that comes from in the biblical studies world, when you're looking at this particular branch of history, you're looking at the end of the leaving Egypt wilderness experience. The story shifts from Moses to Joshua, and then it turns into the conquest and the settlement of the land of Israel. So, just to review the biblical material for you, you remember that in Genesis chapter 12 starts the story of Abraham, and he is promised by God to have, if you're looking for your purse, it's on the high chair.
I'm looking for my letter. I was going to walk to the post office. Go ahead.
Anyway, he's promised, if he will enter into this sacred relationship with Yahweh, that he will be given this land. And the land runs from, in the north, there's a place called Dan. It's in the hill country that goes into Syria, called the Golan Heights. Dan is the source of the Jordan River. The tributaries come out of the highlands, the water running downhill. The Jordan runs south and eventually dumps into the Dead Sea, which is the lowest place on the planet. And there is no water leaving the Dead Sea except by evaporation. So there's quite a buildup of minerals and so forth that are in that body of water. It's 22 times more salty than the Great Salt Lake out in Utah. So my wife and I were there on a couple of occasions, and there's literally people sitting in the sea reading a newspaper. It's that buoyant. A lot of Israeli cosmetics like Ahava get their minerals from the sea. So Dan, south, inland from the Dead Sea, between the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean, is a highland town called Beersheba, sometimes Beersheba, or Va with a V, depends on how you want to translate the Hebrew. So from Dan to Beersheba, from the river to the sea, is the land of Israel. So, you know the story, we read that last time about the children of Israel going into Egypt, and the whole story of Joseph, who is the second half of Genesis. He gets, he's a jerk. His brothers sell him into slavery, and then God is with him. He goes from being a slave in the fields to the viceroy of Egypt, and he's managing their affairs during a famine. And it's interesting, these studies of the biblical material and ancient Egyptian history and so forth are something, can you hear my guineas? Are something that gets a lot of study from a group of people called Egyptologists. And there's a lot of debate about how much, if any, of the biblical material is actually relevant to history. There's a great discussion going on among Egyptologists about the chronology. They're aware of dynastic changes, and once upon a time they counted the dynasties sequentially, one right after another. So they'd say, okay, this one ended here, so the next one started here. And then an amateur Egyptologist pointed out that there were overlapping dynasties and gaps in the dynasties and so forth. And they have been reviving the chronology to try to figure out the ancient history in and of itself. And of course, anybody connected with the scriptures wants to know, who, what, when, where. In the time frames available, the scriptures specifically mention two cities in the Delta that are associated with the reign of a pharaoh by the name of Ramses II. And for decades, that was just kind of a given because of the names of these two cities. It was during his reign, and that was just sort of a given. Well, 150 or so years before Ramses II, in another dynasty, there was a pharaoh named Tutmosis, and then our guy Moses. So people have been looking around at, is that a better time? And they have made some archaeological finds in the Delta, mostly stonework, because the Delta's pretty wet and water destroys everything. But they have found in a couple of digs some interesting things that point to a time that lines up with and has a lot of corollaries with the scriptures. And so there's some debate. Was it Ramses or Tutmosis or back and forth? But anyway, last week we had gotten through Moses leading the Israelites, sometimes called the children of Israel. And remember, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob wrestles with an angel, gets his name changed to he who wrestles with God. And he is the biological progenitor of this large group of people who break out and point to the descendants of Jacob, his immediate children, by Leah and Rebecca and Beulah and can't remember the other one. That there were two regular wives and two concubines, and between these four women they produced, I think, 10 children, and then Joseph had two children by his Egyptian wife that get listed as the children of Jacob to get to the 12. When they come out of Egypt, they are in the wilderness, and then according to the scriptures, every single person who was in Egypt, except for Joshua and Caleb, die in the wilderness. And then principally Joshua, and to a certain extent Caleb, then lead the conquest, sometimes a military conquest, most of the time an infiltration. So for example, what are we talking about here? 2,000, 3,000 years from now, when they're doing the history of the Republic of the United States, they're going to look at the substantial migration from Central and South America into the United States, and they'll talk about the conquest as these folks pour into the country, set up shop and alongside of, and so forth. You see the same thing in India. There are civilizations that connected with the beginning of Hinduism that was an infiltration of Asiatic people through the Khyber Pass into North India, and there was some conquest, some battles, but mostly it was just the steady flow of people looking for a place to live, flowing in, and the culture changed, the language changed, the religion changed, the stories and so forth changed, and you can take a lot of what is in the Hindu sacred scriptures and point out some historical things on the ground. So it's partly a conquest, mostly an infiltration. That kind of thing happened to the Roman Empire. All of us blonde-haired, blue-eyed folks, our ancestors were the Germanic hordes that poured across the border in the 5th century, kind of fleeing the Huns and taking up residence in the thinly populated areas of now modern Germany, the Benelux, France, and literally all the way down into northern Italy. The Lombards were Germans, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Alemanni, the Franks, all of those German tribes. Sometimes they were invited in, sometimes they stormed the border, sometimes they just sort of like came across as families and individuals and set up shop, and they just spoke a different language. So migration is the human story, and here it is in our scriptures, these semi-nomadic people who were literally wandering around the Middle East, starting with Ur up on the Tigris-Euphrates river valleys, migrating down into Egypt, and then back again, and finally settling in the middle, in the land that once upon a time was the Canaanite territory, and then it became the Israelite territory. So today in our reading, we pick up with the book of Joshua, and as we read through that, Wangren's telling the story, retelling the biblical story, which is in itself a narrative. And he does some things like, not entirely sure why, I've been thinking about it all morning. Why on earth did he decide to depict Joshua as a small, frail, nearsighted man? You know, who knows? Maybe he was. In the day before spectacles, everybody had bad eyesight. But anyway, he tells the story of Joshua, who makes the move from Moses' principal assistant. On the death of Moses, Joshua becomes the leader. He's the one that coordinates the confederation of 12 tribes crossing from the wilderness into the promised land. It's really important, that boundary at the Jordan River. We're going to see that again shortly, so keep that in mind. You come out of the wilderness, over the Jordan, into the promised land. So in the Bible, when that happens, they come up to the river, and they bring the Ark of the Covenant with them and so forth. And as soon as the priests start into the Jordan, the water on the north side, the upstream side, is dammed up by God. And all the water on the south side keeps running downhill into the Dead Sea. And the people of Israel cross into the promised land. Okay? So they have now left the wilderness, and they are taking up abode in their promised territory. And the first thing they do is they break out the flint, the stone chip flint knives, and they cut off the foreskin of every single male. Circumcision. It's a sign of the covenant. Why they didn't do it earlier, doesn't say. They did it now. And then, of course, they had to lay around for several days recovering. Most guys will agree it's a good thing it was done when you were 8 days old and you don't remember. But anyway, then the second thing that they do is they celebrate the Passover. Okay, so this is the national festival. This is the thing that forms what it means to be a worshiper of Yahweh, a member of the tribal confederation of the children of Israel. All right, this is, Jew is not a term that's used until the Persians, and it literally means the people who live in Judah. So that's not a term yet. So this is Israelite. You're not an Israelite unless you're celebrating the Passover. You remember the way it's done now. The youngest child that's capable of doing it says, why is this night any different than every other night? And then the oldest male present, and I'm sure in modern America it could be grandma now, but traditionally it's the oldest male says, and this is really important, catch the grammar here, when we were slaves in Egypt. Okay, so this isn't a story about, well, there were these guys that went down into Egypt and they fell into servitude. It's us. You are emotionally in Egypt, and psychologically you're in Egypt, and it may have happened to one of your distant ancestors, but it happened to you, and you own it. And Yahweh, the God of Israel, is your God, and they refer to him every time you see Lord in the scriptures. It's Adonai, my Lord. Personal, possessive relationship. I'm in this covenant relationship. God says do this, and I do. That's the reality that we're trying to communicate here. So they go cross the Jordan and they get a splitting of the waters experience again. They get circumcised. They have Passover. And then Joshua's plan is a good one militarily. He carves out a foothold for the invasion, and that necessitates knocking off Jericho, which is probably one of the oldest cities in the world. Catherine Kenyon, famous archaeologist in the early 20th century, did a dig there and dug down and found walls and multiple layers. One of the things that you'll see here with all these places that you try to locate them now, they'll talk about Tel Jericho. Well, a Tel is something that happens when somebody builds a city near a water source, and then they'll build a wall around it to protect them from beast bandits and bad guys, and then the city eventually gets sacked. Then the next group of people level it off and they build on top of it in the same place because that's where the water is. And after a while it builds up and it kind of looks a little bit like a great big sugar plum. So for example, the Tel at Megiddo, very high, been rebuilt multiple times. So when they get to Jericho, what they found is that it's a Tel, and then up to the crest of the Tel, at the time of the conquest, there was a great high wall built around it, and it had an interesting characteristic about it. You not only had the first wall, but then you had going up, it was all covered in clay by the people that lived there, and then they lived up on top behind another set of walls. So that in order for you to take it, you had to figure out a way to breach the first wall, go up this clay-covered slope, which meant there was no footholds or handholds or anything like that, making going up there extraordinarily difficult, even for the most agile climber. And then the people were on top. Another archaeological piece is that in the ancient world, they weren't any different than us, really. If you were rich, you lived uphill, because when it floods and the sewers back up and everything, that all runs downhill. Also, there's such a thing as a prevailing wind. Okay, so the earth turns on its axis in a certain direction, which means that as it's turning, the wind is from the west. Okay, you know how it is here. You know, everything, you know, you look at the weather and it's like Denver's getting buried. You go, I better go buy some salt because it's moving at 50 to 100 miles an hour, and better part of a week it'll be here, unless it's a real humdinger of a storm, and it'll be here in 3 days. But you know, whatever's happening west of here is coming our way. And then, of course, where we are, there's stuff coming in off the Gulf, and so our weather is shaped by the prevailing weather, and then the stuff coming up from the south. Every once in a while, a storm will be so powerful here that it loops back in and comes out of the northeast, and you all know what a nor'easter is. So we're very aware of the weather as well. Well, they were aware of the weather in the ancient world. And so if you were rich, you built uphill and upwind, okay, because human excrement, and then everything was animal powered, lots of donkeys and, you know, sheep and cattle and all that other kind of stuff. Pretty fragrant reality. It was more pleasant, shall we say, to be uphill and upwind. And so when they're looking at an ancient tell, they kind of know where to dig, you know, to find, you know, it's like, all right, we think if we're going to find such and such a thing, we need to go up here. Well, the poor people were downwind and downhill, and the undesirable people that, like Rahab, the prostitute at Jericho, who took the spies in, her house was on the outer wall, downhill, downwind, and so forth. And so the spies went there, probably got some wine, hung out, and so forth. So, the story is, Walt Wangren tells it. You have a couple of things that I want to point out. And these are in the scripture, so it's really an important reality for us. When Joshua was about ready to take Jericho on, he was doing what we call in the military a leader's recon. And while he was out walking the perimeter of the battle and trying to figure out how am I going to do this, and are there any weak spots and so forth, he runs into somebody in the middle of the night. And he's out there by himself. So he runs into somebody in the middle of the night who becomes identified as the captain of the Lord's host. And he tells Joshua, like Moses before him, take your shoes off. The ground you're standing on is holy. And Joshua and the captain of the Lord's host have a conversation and produce a battle plan. Okay, so that's in here. And Joshua follows that plan, and it's an odd one. So the first day of the battle, the Israelites in a long column walk around the perimeter of the city. After walking around the perimeter, nothing happens that day. Second day, same thing. Third day, same thing. Fourth day, same thing. Fifth day, same thing. Sixth day, same thing. Seventh day, walk around the perimeter 7 times, blow their horns, which are goat horns called shofars, and there is an earthquake, and all the clay comes off the hill, and the walls are blown outward, and the Israelite army attacks, and they kill everybody except for Rahab and the people in her house. And Jericho is gone. Now it's been rebuilt, it's inhabited now. There's a guy named Amir Tsufati who's on Facebook. He is a Israeli, was captain of in command at Jericho, and during one of the peace things he actually signed the city over to Yasser Arafat. So it's still a city and the Jews are still involved there, but that began the conquest. Now Joshua led battles for the rest of his life. So for a good 20 years after this, cities like Ai and Bethel and so forth, he essentially, what Joshua did was he entered the land, established a beachhead at Jericho, went up into the hill country and divided the Canaanites. So he's got this wedge, and then he attacked up and down the spine of the hill country, carving out this Israelite-controlled territory. And then he passed away. But before he passed away, he gathered the entire nation together. And so I'm on page 140 in the Book of God. And this is Wangren's version of this, but it's also in the scriptures. I'm about to go the way of all the earth, said Joshua. Before I go, I must hear your faithfulness. Our most ancient ancestor, Terah, the father of Abraham, served other gods beyond the Euphrates. But the Lord took Abraham and led him here and gave him Isaac. To Isaac he gave Jacob, and to Jacob 12 sons and a daughter. Then Jacob and his children went down to Egypt. The Lord, the same Lord who delivered your parents from the bondage of Egypt, is he who has led you here. God has kept his promise. Israel, you are like the stars of heaven for multitude. You are the descendants that God swore to give to our father, the fruit of our mother's barren womb. You are the nation that was to come from them, and you are home. Okay? Look around you. Where are you? God gave you this. Now, therefore, says Joshua, fear the Lord. Fear here means, to a certain extent, the emotion of fear. It's respect. It's a very clear assessment of just who it is we're dealing with, and being deferential and appropriate, and fear the Lord. Serve him in sincerity. What's the first commandment? I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. Okay? Keep his statutes now as he kept his promises to you. So God created this sacred relationship called a covenant. Think of it as like a treaty where God is the king and he's issuing this treaty to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, now Joshua. He kept his promises to you. He kept his side of the deal. Now you keep yours. Be his people, for he has chosen you, and he is your God. Love him. Suddenly, Joshua lifted his face. He opened his eyes moist and unfocused in the sunlight, and he raised his thin voice like an eagle's claw upon the air. But if you are not willing to serve him, then choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your most ancient ancestors served beyond the river, or the gods of the Canaanites in whose land you dwell. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Very famous verse. Silence returned. It was the same waiting silence with which Joshua had begun his valediction, but then he desired their looking. Now he required their speaking. His raised face sought some word of the people. Almost as one, then the children of Israel said, "Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. It is the Lord our God who did great signs in our sight. He preserved us all through the wilderness. Therefore, we will serve him. He is our God." All right, so the book of Joshua comes to an end at this point in time. He dies, according to the scripture, 110 years old. Born in Egypt, lived out first half of his life in the wilderness and then in the promised land and so forth. Terribly important guy. So now we change to the next chapter, and we are moving into what is the book of Judges in your Bible. So we are going to be looking at a judge initially named Ehud, and then Gideon, and then Jephthah, and Samson, and I think we come to an end with the last of the judges. So I want to say a few words about the way our Bible that we have has come together, okay? So, you know about Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Remember that last one. Second part is called the prophets, the Nabi, in the Semitic languages, to include Arabic. Nabi is prophet. So the Arabs will say that Muhammad is a Nabi. We're going to look at that. The last bit is a kind of a catch-all that has historical narratives and poetry and wisdom literature and that kind of stuff in it. And it's called the other writings, or the historical writings, Ketuvim. So they take the first three letters and they come up with Tanakh, which is how they refer to their Bible. So that is religiously how the Jews understand their Bible. And of course, as Christians, we pretty much inherit that full scale. And then, of course, as Christians, we see Jesus as the prophet, the Nabi that Moses said would come after him, the anointed one, the son of David, who was to be the savior and the redeemer of his people, and so forth. And we go Isaiah's suffering servant, and Jeremiah's new covenant, and so forth. And we go to Jesus. So the stories about Jesus and the literature about the early followers of Jesus is organized in the New Testament in a way that follows the organization of the Tanakh. So you have the Gospels is like Torah, Acts is like the historical writings, and the writings of the apostles is associated with the Nabi. So we have a similar kind of grouping for the New Testament. Obviously, anybody that doesn't buy Jesus as Messiah, I'm not going to look at that. So, come full circle. In Judaism, the highest form of worship is to study Torah. Okay? So, Christians are into Bible study, everybody's at it, and people look at it and they bring in, I think religiously you sort of have an interpretive principle called a hermeneutic of acceptance. You read this as our sacred book, okay? And then you have the scholarly approach where you have an interpretive principle of skepticism. It's a scientific methodology driven, prove it attitude, okay? So, in Germany, which since the time of the Enlightenment, and people like Immanuel Kant was a preacher's kid and philosopher and so forth, very careful, detailed, scientific approaches to everything. That's why Germans are such great engineers and why so much of modern medicine are involved in German culture and so forth. So, and it's not like they're the only ones. There was a great Enlightenment in Scotland and so forth. And quite frankly, the American Republic is a product of the Enlightenment. Locke and the economics of was it Adam Smith, the Wealth of Nations. So when you do both, and I'll tell you an aside, it captures this. At the beginning of World War II, when the Nazis had taken over and were ruining Germany, there were people in the Lutheran Church that went along with the National Socialist hook, line, and sinker. They didn't have a critical thought in their head. Whatever the prevailing wind was, they went with it. There was another group of people who were bound and determined that they were going to be faithful to the Lord and faithful to the Lutheran confessions and to orthodoxy. There were Reform guys who were like it, and they created this thing called the Confessing Church. And they confessed the gospel to the society. Well, they got run out of all the universities, so they created schools for training pastors, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who you hear's name often, was put in charge of one of these up in Prussia, up along the Baltic coast, and near Stettin, and we call it Danzig, and the Poles call it Gdansk, and it's the monastic state of the Teutonic Knights at one point in time in their history. In that school, when they went into worship, they didn't carry anything in with them because the director, Bonhoeffer, wanted them to listen to the scriptures as the word of God for me today. And he particularly wanted them to listen to the scriptures and to the sermon, which in Lutheranism is considered the living prophetic word today, and not to sit there and play academic games and parsing verbs and declining nouns and all that sort of stuff that you have to do across the hall in the classroom. So he expected his students to be cutthroat in the classroom and receptive in the worship service. So that's what we're kind of trying to do here. When you look at the Old Testament, the Tanakh, say, okay, what am I looking at? How did I get it? And so forth and so on. And you bounce it off of what we think we know to be true about history. Then you can start doing some things like, okay, here's a date in history that we know is true. It's an important date, so we put it down. And then we start tweaking things. So for example, if I told you that it's without doubt that the Continental Congress issued a Declaration of Independence from Great Britain on the 4th of July, 1776, okay? That's a fixed date. If somebody comes along with something afterwards and says, well, here's a set of 10 amendments to the Constitution of the Republic of the United States, and I'm going to date it in 1770. You would go, wrong. That didn't happen yet. You have to go to 1776. You have to have 8 years of the Revolutionary War and so forth and so on. And then you have to have the constitutional convention, and then to ratify the Constitution, the states would not go for it without the Bill of Rights, and so that's where you date it. Okay, so you have this fixed date, and you start playing back and forth across it. Okay, so when we get to Joshua, we are into a body of material, and I'm not going to tell you the whole evolution of it, but we're into a body of material that is called the Deuteronomic histories. So that last book of the Torah, the Deuteronomy, means the second giving of the law, the second book of the law. So we know, here's a date in history. If you go to 2 Kings chapter 22 and 23, you are around the year 622 BC. Okay, so that puts you after the northern 10 tribes are wiped out by Assyria in 721, and before the southern kingdom is destroyed in 586. So we know we're in Judah after the Assyrians, but before the Babylonians. Okay, so we've got that spot, 622. King Amos was assassinated, and his 8-year-old son Josiah came to the throne, and the country was ruled by regents until he was an adult. In 622, there was a construction project going on in Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, and they broke down a wall, and in the wall was scrolls, copies of the law. And we have that. We know that that is in the book of Deuteronomy, starting at chapter 5, going through chapter 26. That's what they found, okay? And it was determined what it was and considered significant and taken to the king and read to him. So the story in 2 Kings 22-23 is that Josiah was struck emotionally and psychologically and spiritually, and as a result of this finding of the law in the temple, he launched a religious reform of the kingdom. Okay, so he did all kinds of things. He centered worship at the temple, got rid of the high places where all of the apostasy to Baal and the Asherah poles and so forth took place. He wiped them out. You worshiped in Jerusalem, and he codified, solidified, and so forth, and brought about this great national revival to the worship of Yahweh and so forth. Unfortunately, he died young, and the reforms sort of evaporated, and by 586, the Babylonians had decided to take over what used to be the Assyrian Empire, and they came down, and Judah wasn't playing the game, so the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, knocked off Jerusalem and burned the city and the temple to the ground, and he carried all of the money-making people in Judah off into captivity and set them up in colonies around Babylon where he could keep an eye on them and where they were disconnected from the land and the peasantry that would give them the wealth of agriculture and soldiers and all that kind of stuff. So he decapitated Judah and carried the leadership off into captivity. It's during this captivity period that a couple of things seem to have happened. We know that people like Jeremiah were involved in the fall of Jerusalem. He got carried off into Egypt. Another one that actually I just learned may be Jeremiah's son, certainly his spiritual son, but maybe his biological son, Ezekiel, got carried north into Babylon. And in Babylon, there was a very vibrant Jewish community there, and there was a lot of reflection about what the heck just happened to us and why and blah, blah, blah. And the answer that they came up with, to make it short and simple, is here's the covenant. You go back to Joshua. And what I just read you about, as for me and my house will serve the Lord, all through the Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy, you have these hints about the fall in the captivity and so forth, and it has to do with no longer respecting Yahweh, no longer keeping the covenant, even the priests in the temple becoming perverted by idolatry. False worship is the great sin in the Bible. Worshiping somebody other than Yahweh. And it spills over in the New Testament as well. Jesus said, you can say anything you want about me, guys, but don't you dare attribute the work of the Holy Spirit of God to anybody else. And he says, that is a sin that will not be pardoned ever. Okay, the unpardonable sin is a form of idolatry. So, what scholars think, and this is that higher critical theology and biblical study, going back to the early days of the 20th century, there's a guy by the name of Martin North, and he's a biblical scholar, and when he looked at this stuff, he goes, okay, here's this. The book of Deuteronomy, as we have it, the core of it, 5 to 26, is what they found in the temple. Things have been added onto both ends of the book at different times. But Deuteronomy, the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, the books of Kings, which in the Hebrew Bible is one book, the books of Samuel, the books of Kings, and Jeremiah are all one entity, one unit, okay? If you want to know the story of the people of Israel, Genesis and Exodus, kind of in Leviticus, are kind of a standalone piece, Numbers in there as well. So 4 of the 5 books of the Torah, but you pick up at Deuteronomy, and then you have Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and Jeremiah carries you from Moses to the Babylonian captivity. It's one work by one guy working with source material and so forth. It's called the Deuteronomistic history and so forth. Noth thought that this was written in the 6th century and in Babylon, so that it would have been a part of that vibrant Jewish community in exile trying to figure out what went wrong. Fast forward 50 years, people taking this theory apart back and forth and so forth, and then there's an English guy named Frank Cross, one of the editors of the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian religion. He says Noth's right, but the source material that Noth was using is actually in the form, pretty much in the form that he says, but that's 100 years earlier, and that's done when Josiah is king and working his reform. Okay, so that's where this story all comes from. There's a theology about it. The theology that drives the train here is, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Honor your father and mother, and so forth. The 10 words that are the kind of introduction to the 613 specific tenets of the law of Moses, which constitutes the covenant. and all of its implications. And the deal, you go back to Joshua, keep the covenant or suffer the consequences of not. So the book of Judges that we're reading in now, where first of all, there are 6 major judges and 6 minor judges. A judge is a charismatic military political leader that arises in response to a crisis. God raises them up to deliver the people that have gotten themselves into trouble by getting out from underneath the protection of Yahweh, violating the covenant, and then the natural and logical consequences of that come in. The people repent, they cry for mercy. God raises up one of these judges to save them. And if you look at it, the 6 major judges are kind of hitting all of the neighboring territories and so forth. But the pattern is the people are unfaithful. As punishment, God hands them over to their enemies. The people repent and beg for mercy. God raises up a Shopheth, a judge, and the judge delivers the people, and they are freed from this oppression, and then there's a time of prospering and so forth. But the cycle repeats itself throughout all of Judges. The 12 stories combined, there's this disintegration that happens, and there's some themes of not being faithful to the covenant, and then it's like Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, and so forth. The consequences of the sin start rippling out, and there's a disintegration that happens. Some of the concepts that are really reinforced in these stories of the judges are the sovereign freedom of Yahweh, that he can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants. Another theme is that God uses flawed individuals. So, for example, the champion Samson, who is used against the Philistines, I think at Gath, a coastal city, and Samson's an idiot, okay? He, just God used him. That's all you can say about him. Not too bright. One of the things that's interesting in Judges is that if you read Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, the Ark of the Covenant is a major, major deal. The tabernacle's a major deal. It's a centering piece. The consecration of Aaron and his sons as the priest. And then you get into Judges and the disintegration of the people, the failure to honor Yahweh, the failure to live according to the covenant spills into the cultic practice. And there's very little, if any, that I can think of: tabernacle, priesthood, Ark of the Covenant, etc. It's part of the disintegration of the people down to a level of chaos, and then they end up settling at the end. There's that horrific story of the Levite's concubine, who he throws to a mob, and then she's literally raped to death, and then he has her body drawn and quartered and sent around Israel going, "Ain't it awful?" And that story is horrible. And you see that the people of Israel and this 12-part tribal confederation have gone about as low as you can go. You can't imagine anything worse than that. And then it's out of this that God raises up a judge who is also a prophet, and he is a kingmaker, and his name is Samuel. And so we get in Samuel the institution of the monarchy, starting with Saul from the tribe of Benjamin. And Saul is an interesting figure. We'll get to him. We'll get to the whole monarchy. But so you have this 450-year period of time covered by the stories of these judges. Scholars think that these are stories because it's in different places among the 12 tribes, and they're raised up in response to kind of local issues that affect 3 or 4 of the tribes, and the ones that are physically far away is impacted. What else can I say? Can't stress enough from Joshua through to Jeremiah the absolute critical nature of this concept. Personal loyalty to Yahweh. Nothing is more important. Couple of side things in here. In the ancient world, like for example in Athens, women were not talked about. They were not to be seen. Their place was in the home, and they were only out in public when they were escorted to like a religious festival or whatever. And that's pretty common throughout the ancient world. You still had problems that are associated with women, like for example the young Spartan queen Helen that runs off with the Trojan prince. His name was Alexander, and they also called him Paris. And the start of the Trojan War was these star-crossed lovers. But women were, it kind of made sense, and if you think about it, they were married young and very busy trying to survive having children and rearing them, and nobody lived very long in those days. So it would have been very rare for a woman to have the opportunity to do anything great outside the home, and they would have to be like a Vestal Virgin at Rome or a queen of a city-state or something like that. In the book of Judges, you have one of the most significant of the judges, Deborah, who is a prophetess, and she rises to prominence. And in fact, she tells the one male guy that's supposed to be leading the army, I'm telling you what the Lord's given me. And he goes, well, I'm not going unless you come with me. And she said, if I go with you, you're not going to get any of the credit. And we all know Deborah. We don't know his name. And then in that same story, the bad guy king flees the battlefield, and he takes refuge in a tent that he thinks is with an ally. And the woman comes in and drives a tent peg through his head. So, the women are there, and they are strong. They don't get into the literature very often, but they do in Judges. So if you're looking for strong women, read Judges. They're there in number. Just to give you some time frames, 622 BC, 721 is the destruction of the northern 10 tribes. 622 is the Josiah reforms that were kind of the high water mark of Judah. It's all downhill after that. 586 BC is when the Babylonians wrecked Judah, destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. In 540, the Israelites are in exile, and they come to understand that they're there because of not being faithful to the covenant. And it's in 540 that you get that story about the handwriting on the wall, actually from right to left because God speaks Hebrew. The destruction of Babylon by the Persians, which are actually called the Achaemenid Empire. Persians and Medes swept in and knocked off Babylon and so forth. That's in 540. And then Cyrus, who is the great liberator of the Jews, he says to every one of the exile groups, not just the Israelites, but to everybody, the enemy of my enemies, my friend. You're here in exile. You can go home and I'll pay for it. And to the Israelites, he approves rewalling Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple, and the only thing he asks is that you pray for me. And so that begins the Persian period from about 539 onward, and only a remnant went back, okay? So that's what we were reading today with the stories of Ehud, Gideon, Jephthah, and of course Deborah's in there, and the horrible story of the Levites' concubine, which is intended literally to show you how far they fell. And then the next step, where we start part 4, short Saul, David, Solomon rule over the United Kingdom. That's really the heyday. And you can remember it, the year 1000 BC is in the middle of David. So Saul is further back in time than that, and Samuel is moving toward the year 0. So each of them's 40 years. So 1040 is Saul, 960 is Solomon, David's in the middle. So that's what we're reading next time. Thank you so much for joining me, and pray for Gloria and her family. Poor dear's passed on, and she just had, the isolation and in and out of the hospital, and then she and her mom went into a retirement facility, and both of them got COVID, and Gloria passed away, and her poor mom is recovering from the COVID, but it's the tragedy of this pandemic is that people who would have had folks visiting and helping to brighten their life and so forth, isolated by this pandemic, and it's just sad. So one thing that you can do is pick up the phone and call your family, your loved ones, your friends. Keep touch. This is a piece of technology that allows you to put words on paper, shove them in an envelope, and mail them. Remember first-class letters? Why don't you write somebody today? Tell them you're thinking of them, that you love them, you're praying for them, and just let that bless their day. So, God bless you. Next Wednesday, 9 o'clock, we will do part 4, the Kings of Ancient Israel. See you then.